Everybody, and thanks for joining us again. Today we have Heather Wellman with us for our podcast and our exciting conversations. Heather is a doctor of conflict resolution and has somebody that I have known for a long time who has been a guide for me in many ways and did help me out in working through my own path with my doctorate as well. We did it together. And she changed a lot of my perspectives. So as we get going today and we get going through time, she's the type of leader that I would like other people to listen to and focus on. So that's why we invited her along to our conversation today. So welcome, Heather.
Thank you.
So Heather, Efrvsnt as a company, we're focused on people, and you're a people person as far as I know. And we like to get to know everybody. And so in that, as try to get to know you better and you try to put yourself out there to share with us a little bit about who you are. If you could do that, tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. Okay, so I'm an educator and administrator in Colorado, and I've been doing that for several years. And before that, I owned my own company, and my company worked on contract with mediation and capacity building in different sort of nonprofit organizations. And before I owned my own company, I worked in nonprofit leadership. So I've always had this kind of leadership role in life. I've worked internationally and locally, and I've worked just building up different types of organizations through things like trainings and mediation, conflict resolution, how to have a handbook, how to build capacity, how to build systems, and all of those kinds of things. In my personal life, I have 3 kids ranging in age from 14 to 21, and my 2 older kids are at college, and my younger one's here with me, and I'm married to my husband, Robert, who works for the railroad, which is kind of like everybody loves trains, right? And we're building a house, and we live on a farm in Beulah, so that's also an interesting little factoid about me.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of the pictures of this. How's it going?
It's great. We are finally making some real progress on it, so I feel very excited. We have been in this state of limbo for quite some time, and then when COVID hit, it just delayed things even worse. So I was starting to lose a little bit of hope, but now there's light at the end of the tunnel. So yeah, hopefully by January we'll be in the house.
Is there a roof over it yet?
Not yet, no.
Okay.
No.
So as we we all move and we move through life, and life's a funny conversation piece. And I know that sometimes it's very fast, sometimes it's very slow. And one of the things I try to focus on is work-life balance. How's yours look?
I think I have a pretty good work-life balance. When I was younger, my life was just crazy. I grew up, my mother was ill when I was growing up, so I was forced to start working when I was very young to help my family and do those things. And I really learned how to compartmentalize work and home and how to find other interests outside of work. So I have this friend who's a workaholic, and I would consider myself also a workaholic, but her whole life 100% is always about work. When you talk to her, it's about work. When you are near her, she's talking about work. Her home is surrounded by work. And so I have just tried to really create intentional boundaries around that. So even if I have to work at night, and often I do have to work at night, that's just the reality of life. I always protect my lunch time and my dinner time. I'm real weird about lunch. My boss just laughs all the time because I'm during lunch, I eat lunch. We're not talking about work. And so I protect certain spaces of time. And then I also rely on my family to help me maintain that balance. So if I am going too far one way or the other, I'm backing off on work too much or I'm backing off on home too much, we just have a set of cues in our house to let other people know that you're not behaving in a way that is good for your work-life balance. So my husband or even my children might cue me that something has to be corrected and we have to make a course change. And that's really helpful. My daughter who's 14, she's really good at this. We just use the word cue. That's our cue. And so she'll just come in and she'll be like, hey mom, this is your cue. And I'll be like, oh, cool. Okay, great. How's this impacting you? And then we figure out how to fix it. But you just really have to take that time to make space for yourself and protect those areas that are important to you. And I'm a huge foodie. I don't know, food's my thing, right? So I really protect my meal times. Those are sacred times for me.
And you bring up something that's very interesting, and you even use the word boundaries. And I've been reading a couple books on boundaries because not just the business boundary, the work-life balance, just boundaries as a whole is something we all seem to violate. And then you said you've managed to get your family involved, and your daughter comes in and goes, "Mom, cute." That's meaning you've probably overstepped a boundary. How did you create?
So I think the most important part in creating those boundaries is to learn not to take things personally, right? Like your boundary isn't about me, it's about you. And my boundaries aren't about you, they're about me. And so you just have to really communicate that with the people that you love. And sometimes it takes a little bit of trial and error, right? Like you have to really be like, okay, that hurt my feelings. And the other person can be like, I'm not intending to hurt your feelings. This is like the boundary. And I think that sometimes the reason we violate boundaries is we see them as this black or white thing that we set ourselves, when really boundaries are set in community. Like governments didn't come up with boundaries of countries. The United States didn't say this is our boundary. Like they worked on that boundary in community with other countries, right? And so what we try to do in our personal and even in our professional lives is establish boundaries without that community. And we're like, well, this is my boundary and you violated it, without that sort of give and take of what a boundary looks like. I would work 24 hours a day, but my family says that's not okay. And so then we work on how to establish like what that looks like and how that feels for everybody. And you got to talk, like communication's key, right? Like that's the point. Talk with your friends and family and coworkers.
Yeah, and what I agree. It's also how we talk. I think it's how we talk. It's not just talk, because a lot of people put talk on the table and other people go, I'm not picking that up.
Right. I don't know if you remember this, but we read this book in our program called like, That's Not What I Meant. I can't remember the author, but it's a really old book. It's like from like the 70s or 80s. And when I read that book, I'm like this, I have an undergrad in communications. Like I'm a really good communicator. I have always felt like really empowered to be a great communicator. And then when I read that book, I was like, oh my gosh, we should mass print this book and hand it out to people, because it really talks about the different ways that you can communicate and express those feelings without being like mean or hurtful, or when you are mean or hurtful, like how to like go back and address those things. So I think that that's like part of like the issue that we have in the world today. Like we all want to be assertive about our needs, but we don't always necessarily assert that in a way that is nice and friendly and kind to the people that we're asserting those needs to, right? Like I protect my lunch, but if somebody walks into my lunch, I don't say like, oh my gosh, this is my lunch, you violated my boundary. I'm like, hey, I don't know if you know this or not, but like, this is my lunchtime. And I know it seems weird because a lot of people work through lunch in the United States, but for me, this is really important because I eat weird and this is the time for me to reset myself. And if you don't want to see the hangry, cranky Heather, I need to eat my lunch right now. Is there something that I can help you with in 10 minutes? And usually people are like, oh yeah, of course, you know, because we have like that nice dialogue with one another instead of that sort of defensive and accusatory dialogue.
Right. The style of communication within the system matters.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I do remember that book. I have it on my shelf. For those of you who want the author, it's Deborah Tannen's book, isn't it?
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. I've read it several times, and I think she's also the author of How to Get to Know Without Causing Conflict.
Yeah, she is. And I do highly recommend this book. It's super easy to read. It's meant for just like the everyday reader. And I actually, my husband isn't a big reader. And so actually when I first read it, I would read passages out loud to him at night. And then we would like practice different, like you have to practice everything in life, right? Like, why do you think you can be a baseball star with practicing thousands of hours, but suddenly you're a perfect communicator without any practice, right? So it feels weird and it's embarrassing sometimes, but you have to be like, hey, can we practice this technique? And so my husband and I actually practiced it a lot, and it was weird, and he thinks it's crazy, and we'll get in the car and he'll be like, oh my gosh, are you about to mediate me? But we've practiced, and now it's like effortless and seamless, and that's just the way that we talk to each other. And so that book was lifesaver.
And there's some books that come out like that, and you're just like, yes, you got it.
You know, I think the practice element that you brought up is really important, because I know as a woman, we are socialized to speak a little bit differently, you know, and to be a little bit softer in our language. And something that I have found myself needing to go back and practice doing is removing the word just from my vocabulary. So as a woman, we are usually the ones writing email, hey, I'm just circling back about this. I'm just checking in on this thing. And I have to purposely go through my emails and edit out the just, because I find myself using them a lot. And I think that that's one of those things that ties into those boundaries that we as women are constantly doing, because we're afraid to set those boundaries. I think more so than men are typically with setting boundaries.
Yeah. And I think that communication role also plays in reverse for men. Like, men are sort of conditioned to be like, to suppress their emotions, or to speak like directly and with authority, and those kinds of things that aren't always necessarily good for building teams or building consensus and those kinds of things. So that practice element really helps. One of the things that I employed with my children from a very young age is when we had conflict, when the conflict was over, we would rehash, like we would do like a what went well, what didn't go well kind of conversation in the conflict. And then we would practice how we could resolve that conflict better. And so, but it was after all the heat of the emotion was over. But then the next time that conflict came up, we had already practiced how we were going to sort of address it. And then it made it so much easier. Like, it was just a really good tool. I practice everything on my kids before I practice it with people on my team or my coworkers. Like, they're my sort of guinea pigs. So they're a little weird.
Is there a way you think to implement that in the business realm? Because I love that. I love rehearsing it when the emotion is removed. Is there a way that you could apply that with your peers and your coworkers?
I think that it absolutely works perfectly in the business world. And so in my own personal experience, what I do a lot is I like to go back and talk about it. So it's kind of like in this circle of conflict resolution. And I've always said, this isn't, official, this is my own personal theory, that the last little framework in conflict resolution is the new conflict. And so are you able to handle the next conflict better than you handled the last conflict? And so in sort of the business world, we are going to work through this conflict. And once the conflict is resolved, we're going to do the same kind of thing. Like, what do you think went well about this conflict? Like, what did we do good in solving this? And what could we have done better? And some of the feedback that I've gotten from that has really shaped me as a person. Like, for example, I had a teacher that I worked with a few years ago, and we did this, rehash of our conflict that we were having over some instructional strategies. And she just basically said, we talked about what went well, which is always nice to hear. But then she was like, what didn't go well is you're so solutions focused that you didn't think about the real world impact of my emotions in that moment. And I'm like, heard, right? Like, I hear you. And what could I do better to show you that I do care about your emotions? That's why I'm solutions focused, because my wisdom and experience says if we get to the solution, your emotions will be better. And so we just talked through that. And then moving forward in the future, I knew that the first thing I had to do was validate, affirm, listen, and have that experience. And it wasn't disingenuous, right? Like, I'm not validating and affirming because she told me that's what she needed. I was already thinking I was doing that, but I wasn't doing it in a way that she could hear. And so we just went back, and the next time that we had a conflict, we didn't have that same problem. And she was much more receptive to the solutions that we were developing together, because we fixed that one stupid small problem. And it was really just a communications issue. It wasn't a values issue. We were in the same value space, just in a different communication space. So I think that in the business world, it feels awkward. And I think that's why people avoid doing it. It's weird, right? Like, it's awkward. You're going to talk about something that might feel slightly uncomfortable, and it's something that a lot of us don't do. So you may not have a very good model for it. And so I would really encourage people who are interested, reach out to someone who, knows how to do this stuff. Reach out to you guys, reach out to me, reach out to someone who can tell you, this is how to have an awkward conversation. but you will definitely feel better after you've done it. And once you've done it like 10 times, then it's not awkward anymore because you're like used to it, right? Like you've adapted.
Well, it's funny you said awkward conversation, because I was just looking over some things in considering our conversation, and you said awkward conversation. I thought that's it, is that we have to be able to have an awkward conversation. And then go back to, you said, I practice everything on my children. That's definitely a place for awkward conversations. How do we as adults have awkward conversations with others, especially in the business world, where people have become so locked into there's only one way to do things? And you need to say to them, all right, but what about these other ways? How else is your system working? How do we have those awkward conversations? How do you have them?
I think that just in our society, especially right now, people are really locked in, like they've like dug their heels in and entrenched in things. And so I think the most important thing to do is figure out that shared value. So I don't know if you've read like Simon Sinek's like Start With Why or like Find Your Why. I think that what I really like about what he talks about specifically is that when you start with your why, you have found the shared value. And so I'll just use education as an example, because I don't know if you know this, Lisa, but in education, people tend to get a little bit catty about their opinions, right? Like teachers can be a tiny bit catty, and that's fine. It's because we all share the same why. I have never, even teachers I've greatly disliked, I've never met a teacher who wasn't there because they wanted to help kids learn and they cared about kids. Like we share that value. And so when we start our conversations from a place of like, we're the same, we're taking different roads, but we're really the same. We have this deeply held shared belief. And so that helps us like establish that. And I think that it's also really important in the business world to establish that you don't have to like each other. Like we don't have to be friends. We're never going to go to Chili's and have drinks. And that's okay, right? Like that is 100% fine, but I'm really good at my job and you are really good at your job, and we can be good together in a work environment. And I think that when we say things like, oh, it all starts with relationships, that people take that too far. They're like, they think that relationships mean that I'm going to invite you over to my house and we're going to have a barbecue and we're suddenly best friends sharing secrets. And that doesn't have to be the basis of our relationship. We can have a very professional relationship that says, you're good at your job, I'm good at my job. And when we're talking about our job, we're going to listen to one another and establishing those norms for how that we're going to do that. And I even hate the word norms, because I feel like it's been co-opted into being like this, oh, we're going to have norms kind of thing. But we can have these conversations like, when we're talking, Cade, it really annoys me when people interrupt me. And then you say, oh, I got you. When you're talking, Heather, it really annoys me when all you do is ask questions. And I'm like, heard, right? And so like, then we can have like these sort of shared ideas about how we talk to each other. And it's not always the same with everybody. Like we establish these norms, like everybody's opinion matters and we're going to listen. And we establish those for every single group, right? Like how many norm setting sessions have you been in where every single norm is the same? That's ridiculous, right? Like me and Cade are going to have very different norms because we've known each other for like, 10 years. We're really good friends. We do know some of each other's secrets, right? And so like, we're going to have like a very different kind of set of norms than Lisa and I, who I just met today, would have, because we don't have that same kind of relationship. So I think that the idea is great, and it's been taken by too far. Like I always talk about life as like this pendulum, right? Like, so sometimes we want things are bad and they're swinging over here and we want them to get better. So we swing over here, and that's not any better, right? Both sides of this are bad. So we just have to find a way for it to like swing back to the middle where it's the nice sweet spot for how we develop those kind of things. And establishing awkward conversations, I think a really great way to start an awkward conversation is to say, this is going to be an awkward conversation. Are you in? Like, are you here for the awkward? Because I'm here for it. I'm going to push through the awkward. If you're also willing to push through the awkward, we're going to get to the other side and it's going to be good. And the next time we have this conversation, it's going to be slightly less awkward.
Yeah.
And I just think being really upfront about that is also helpful, so people know that you also think it's awkward.
It's not your norm.
Right. It's not the normal way of being, but it's okay. It's okay to be uncomfortable. Like, you know, you're just like, hey, Lisa, I want to try something. I want to try to have this conversation about our conflict. And I know it's going to feel really awkward, and it's going to feel very awkward for me too. But I think that if we can have the conversation, when we get through it, we're both going to feel a lot better. And the next time that we have a conflict, it's going to be a lot less painful, or it's going to be a lot less difficult for us to navigate if we do have this conversation. Would you be willing to take this risk with me? And then people will be like, okay, if you're here, I'm here, right? You know, and I've never had anybody say no to me.
Right.
So
it's interesting because you and I have both done the consulting work from our experience of conflict resolution and going out and helping groups of people. And the hardest thing for me was to get these people who came to me and said, help me, to then say, okay, here's what it's going to look like. And then once I presented what it's going to look like, they all went, oh, I don't want that. You know, bar none, they all said, yeah, but. I started with the why, and then I've always said, start with the why, explains how we get to the how.
Right.
And then I got, yeah, but not that. And so a lot of what I did, what I would call was psychoeducational, was go in and say, here's the variables that we have to work on. And I think your approach of, okay, it's going to be an awkward conversation, start off that way might be a better approach to say, it's going to be an awkward conversation, and this is what we have to work on.
And I think it's a little bit different in consulting than it is when you're in like your own company doing the work. So like in consulting, we're coming in to give them this support, right? Like I'm here to support you, but you're not actually part of it, right? And so it's easier to kind of push back. When I'm in my own organization, what I like to do is model always. So for example, I was trying to implement some restorative justice, restorative practices ideas at my school, and there was a ton of pushback. It is a very complex and challenging issue to manage student behavior in a school setting. And so there is a lot of pushback from teachers when you try to come up with these like sort of restorative issues. And so I'm like, okay, great. I tried to go full force in, right? Like I tried to just punch my way in with it, and it did not go well. So instead, what I did is I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to personally do these things, and I'm going to model how it can work and how it doesn't always work at first, right? Like it's the kind of practice where the first 50 times you do it, it might not work, but that 51st time, it is going to be amazing. And it is going to make all those 50 failures 100% worth it, right? And so I just tried to model that. And as I've done that, people have started being like, oh, you're the behavior management expert. And I'm like, well, I'm actually the conflict resolution expert, which I guess is kind of behavior management. But what they've started to see is that I can do it. And then I expanded my circle just a little bit to people who had shown interest. So now it's me and like 4 other teachers doing it, right? Because we've all agreed to do it, and I trained them and we worked on it. And now we've started this snowball where other people are also going to get on. And are there still a few outliers who absolutely refuse to get on board? Absolutely. But the vast majority of people are on board. And I think that that's also something that we encounter a lot in business models or government models, whatever we're looking at today, where people are like, if it's not 100%, it's an F. But that's not true. You know, my husband loves to have this saying. He wasn't very, he didn't get good grades in school. I'm sorry, Robert, but he didn't get good grades in school. And so he always would say, when I was studying so hard, right, because I always did get good grades in school, he would always say like, C's get degrees, right? And I think that we have to sort of look at that model when we move into business. Like it doesn't have to, or government, it doesn't have to be 100%. Like 100% is the best, right? Like that's the absolute mark of excellence, but it isn't what's necessary to be effective, right? Like what in schools, we say 80% is mastery, right? Like if you get 80%, you have mastered the content. So if 80% is mastery, why are we always striving for 100% in everything? Like, and I'm a huge excellence kind of person. Like I always want to do everything with excellence, but I also understand that we may not be able to achieve that, especially when there's, 500 people in your organization. You getting 500 people to do the same thing, or even in a school where you have 50 teachers, getting 50 teachers to all do the same thing, that's a really high bar. That may not be something that's achievable. And so we set ourselves up for that failure, and then we say it failed, when really it might not have. It might not just have met that sort of like 100%.
Do you think that that has anything to do with like an individualistic society, that you have to be the best or otherwise it's just not worth it at all?
I think that it has a lot to do with just the way that we evaluate things and fund things, and just the way that we establish this sort of like competitive nature. And I'm super competitive. If you want to play a board game with me, we're about to throw down, right? Like I am highly competitive. But a few years ago, I went to this women's leadership conference. It was really cool. It was in California. And before you went, you had to have somebody that was your colleague, somebody that was your boss, and somebody that you had supervised fill out this questionnaire form for you, and about like your leadership and like who you are as a person. And so the person that I had supervised, what they wrote on my form was that I'm the type of leader who believes that other people's success is my success, and that I'm not successful without their success. And I think that's really the core of like leading from the front. And so when we talk about this, like you can be competitive and cooperative at the same time. But the way that you are that is when you see that your whole group needs to be successful, and that you're only as strong as your weakest link. So if we're not establishing strong support networks in our organizations to build up our team members, to really say, if the mailman, the guy walking around doing the mail isn't the most successful mailman, then we haven't done our job in supporting this appropriately. And I think that goes back to a lot of our idea about pay as well. And so what does have value and what doesn't have value in our organizations? So do we value the lowest paid member of our group by making sure that they, make a living wage, and that they are part of our team, and that they have a say-so, and that they get to contribute and have some onus over their own realm? And this idea of like expertise, like I clean my house, right? But I wouldn't know how to clean a school. And so do we value the expertise of the lead custodian who does clean our school? And when he says like, hey, Heather, can you please stop doing this weird thing because it's creating a mess? Do I listen, and do I honor that? And do I bring everybody in together and make sure that we raise each other up, and then we make our team the best? And really, competition is the desire to be recognized for our achievement. And we get to decide what that looks like for each of us. Like we get to decide what that recognition looks like. So is it money? Is it accolades? Or is it just knowing that you have done a good job? Like what level of actualization are you at? And how can we bring the rest of our team up to that higher level so that we can really work together and be cooperative in nature? And I think that sometimes, sorry, Cade, I think that sometimes women are really well suited to this because we grow up in with a cooperative idea. And when it starts to break down is when we enter systems in the workplace that are built on non-cooperation, and we try to fit into those. And so we have to resist, resist. And really make sure that we show that cooperation and making sure that everybody is included is really, really the way to build success inside of an organization and inside of a society.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that statement. Just from my own life experience in business, trying to go against that cooperative nature never served me.
Right.
It never did. I would try to fit the mold of whatever business I was a part of or was in. And when it wasn't cooperative, I was never successful.
And I was never happy.
No.
I worked for this one organization in the for-profit world, and it was miserable for me. And finally, my husband just said, like, quit. And I was like, I have to have a job, right? Like, I'm sorry, I have to have a job. And he was like, you don't have to have a job that bad. Like, we'll eat ramen. Because it was just I was trying to get out of like myself, right? And so I think that's also really important that we try to just go back to that why, and that we find places for ourselves to fit into that work for us, right? That work with who we are as people. And that if we find ourselves in a place where that isn't true, that we really try to find the people in that organization who are like us, and then we work to make that organization or make our team better. And through that, we can model why it is the better way. Because it is.
So when you're doing the hiring then for leaders that you're trying to mold, what are some characteristics that you look for to find that cooperative nature?
Yeah, so the first thing that I want to do when we're hiring a leader for an organization, or even when I'm hiring anyone, I want to talk to other people that they've worked with. And I want to ask them like real poignant questions about that kind of stuff. Like, what happens if you're in a conflict with this person? Like, what happens if you disagree? How do you think that they would, respond or behave? And it's always amazing to me, because I just want you to know, if you ever use me for a reference, when people call me for a reference, I always try to say really nice things. I mean, I try to be honest, right? Like, I've learned this beautiful art of, what if you're not really good at that thing? Like, trying to be honest without like being mean or, giving a bad reference. Why would someone list you as a reference if you're going to give a bad reference? But what I've been shocked about in hiring is how honest people are when you call to get references. I'm like, woo, I would have never suspected. But I think it's really important to get those references and to talk. I think it's also important to have those task-oriented interview questions. So we're really familiar with interviews where we come in and we say, like, tell us about yourself, or if you were in this situation, how would you react? Or tell us about a time you were really successful, or what are your strengths and weaknesses? Like those typical interview questions. But I think what is really helpful in an interview is to have task-oriented interview questions. So for example, can you please give me, here's a topic that we frequently deal with, right? Like I just did one on school discipline. And so I'm like, can you please give us a 15-minute professional development on what school discipline looks like for you? And then you learn a lot about that person, and you learn about their presentation skills and those kinds of things. Or we say, we're going to do a practice coaching session. And so you're going to watch 15 minutes of a video of a teacher, and then you're going to tell me what the teacher is doing incorrectly, give me the highest lever point for that teacher to improve. And then you're going to show me what a coaching conversation would look like with that teacher. And that makes interviews really scary, right? Like as the interviewee, like that's scary. But as the interviewer, you have to be gracious, right? And understand people are under pressure. But also it really gives you a glimpse into how a person would really, one, act under pressure, and two, how they would address those kind of issues in real life. And I'll just give that coaching example. I've done this in many different interviews. I've asked them to just show me what that coaching conversation looks like. We practice it. We like get to see it. And the wide variety of how people approach that really gives you so much insight into how they will behave in the future. And it's been almost like, it's my favorite interview thing to do, because it's so clear how they're going to be in the workplace.
I love that. I think that's something that I think most people wouldn't consider, because I think even as the interviewer, you're nervous yourself because you want to make sure that you're asking the right questions and getting the most out of them. But I do love the task. I think that does show you a lot.
I think we all want to be nice too. I think that like we want to be kind and gracious because we've been the interviewee, right? And this is a potential employee for us. So we want to come across in the best light that we possibly can. And I would just encourage people to think about that and say, like, when you do different types of things like this, like when you're trying to figure it out, you are coming across in the best light because you show that you like deeply care about the people who are in that role. And plus it's an excellent opportunity to show what your organizational values are, because when you're hiring someone, you don't just want to, we all want a job because we need the money, right? Like mama's got to pay her rent, but also you want that person to be happy in your organization. They want to be happy. You want to be happy. It's like a reciprocal relationship. And sometimes I don't think we see it as a reciprocal. It's that I'm the interviewer and I'm hiring you to be part of my amazing company. But really it's the interviewee saying, I'm selecting you to give my time and my talent and my effort to. And so that it's like a marriage. Like I spend more time at work than I do with my husband. So I need to make sure that I've really, really chosen the right place for me and that we've made that great marriage. And I think by having those sort of interview questions and establishing that right in the front, that's the greatest kindness, because the interviewee can then say like, ooh, this isn't for me. And that's okay, right? Like we can't take that personally. Like that's okay. Not every date works out, right? And so it establishes a good start to that working relationship, in my opinion.
If you could, given the opportunity to send out one message to the world or one message out there to everybody in the ether and say, this is how to create the best version of their lives, their working place, their opportunities, what would that look like?
Don't take everything so personally. We're all human beings, like living inside of our own skin, and as afraid and self-conscious as you are, the person on the other end is just as afraid and self-conscious. And sometimes we interpret in our lives that the other person is super confident and they have it together, or they think that they're right and know everything, and that we are, we're going to be embarrassed or humiliated, but the other person is also feeling that exact same way. So give them the same kindness that you would want to be given, and don't be afraid to do hard things. Don't be afraid to do hard things. You should do something that sucks every single day. Like it, and you will be rewarded for it. Recently, I live right in front of a mountain, and it's called Greenhorn Mountain, and I wanted to hike to the top of this mountain. So I went up there. The first time it rains, and it gets rained out. It's like hailing, raining. There's no way, right? And I'm like, oh, well, that's ruined. But I didn't give up. So the second time I go back, and I'm wearing shorts, and it is 35 degrees at the top of the mountain. So I'm like, oh my gosh, seriously, again? So I don't go. I don't get to the top of the mountain. The next time I go up, I'm like, I brought sweatpants and a sweatshirt and shorts and a backpack and a rain jacket. I was like prepared, right? But I was that prepared because I had learned from all those other really kind of not great experiences. So I get to the top of the mountain and I lose the trail, and I'm terrified. I'm at the top of this mountain. Nobody knows where I'm at. I'm by myself. There's bears somewhere close by. I know it. And so I'm terrified. And I just stopped. I sat down in this beautiful field of wildflowers. I took a few minutes. I took some breaths. I cried a little bit, to be honest. And then I said, you know what to do. You are an experienced mountain hiker. You know what to do. Stand up. You're okay. And I stood up and I found the trail. I looked around. I used my land markers. I did all the things I'm trained to do, and I found that trail. But it was very hard. And when I got to the car at the end, my legs were shaking. I had tear stains. I was starving. I had this very emotional experience. But one of the greatest experiences that I've had is getting lost on that trail and finding my way back home, because I really accomplished something. Like, you just can't be afraid to have that awkward conversation, to take that risk and say what you need, to try to build a community at your work instead of a competitive environment. Take the risk, do the hard thing, because in the end, you're going to have climbed a mountain.
I love that. I love that. That's amazing. I like the part with the bear. The bear would have scared me.
Oh my gosh. I didn't actually see a bear, but I knew the bear was there. I knew it. Like, I just could feel it in my bones.
What are, if you want to share some of your goals for yourself over the next, 5 to 10 years, what would you hope, what's the next mountain that you're hoping to climb?
So I really want to move into school administration, like move into higher up school administration positions. I'm really passionate about educational inequity and teaching our students in the best possible way, and really seeing a big reform in schools away from high stakes testing to more asset-based education. And so that's one thing that I want to do. And when I moved to Colorado, I shut down my consulting business because it was just a lot for me at the time. I had 3 kids, 2 in high school, this kid in elementary school. My husband had taken on a new job. We were moving to a farm, like all this crazy stuff was going on. So I had shut that down because I just didn't have time to focus on my career and on my consulting business at the same time. But I'm really looking forward to opening it back up again and doing some more conflict resolution consulting with organizations. And I think that now more than ever, like, that's really needed. We need the voices of reason to be out in our communities talking about how we can heal and how we can resolve our conflicts inside the business world, inside the government world, and inside our personal world. Because right now, I just see a world that needs a lot of conflict healing, and I want to be a part of that. And I want to share that skill that I've built up over the years with people, because I've perfected it by practicing on my kids.
They're great for that.
They're fantastic.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. You have given us so much to consider, and I think it's such a value add for our viewers. So thank you so much. And hopefully we can have you on the podcast again, because I love talking to you.
Yeah, that would be great. And it was really fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Heather.
Absolutely.